Hey everyone, so today's the first day of the Expo, and this year Drake is going first because it seems like they've got some of the coolest ships. So today I'm going to take a look at their display in the Expo, and then also take the chance to get a more in-detail look at the new cutter, which is Drake's new starter ship. And then also when the PTU was still going on, I got a bit of a chance to fly around the Scorpius, and I don't have a ton to say about that, so I'm just going to lump that into the end of this video. So if there's anything that you're specifically interested in, there's going to be timestamps as usual, so you can just skip to that part of the video. But first I'm going to get started with that tour of the Expo. Alright, so here we are at the Expo, and as you can see, the color theme is the same as what the skins are going to be for the best in show ships. I think they've shown images of those on their website so far, but yeah, I'm kind of excited for the red theme. It's my favorite color. This red theme is pretty fitting considering Drake has a few notable ships that are being released here, and they're actually going first this year at the Expo. So you can see that schedule for the Expo here, and let's go on to the event hall. The Expo's going on at New Babbage again. They're just reusing the Tobin Center, but I think that's fine. There's no need to spend time making a whole new Expo hall just to have it somewhere else. Alright, so as you can see, this is a Drake sponsored event. And there's going to be a lot of ads for Drake, it looks like. And they're today's featured manufacturer, as you can see. Alright, so yeah, this is still the Tobin Expo Center, which we've seen before, but I'm really liking what they've done with the theme. And the different color to the ceiling, and the accent color changes really gives it a different vibe, so it almost feels like a whole new expo hall. So here's the map for today. This is going to be all Drake ships. As you can see, they've got a lot of Corsairs on display. And then the other new ship is the cutter, which I'm excited to be able to take a look at. And then there's also going to be a holoviewer model of the Kraken, which will be coming at some point. Alright, so it seems like Drake is very proud of the Corsair. I think as they should be. We've got 3 examples of it here. Although they're all displaying the weakness of this low ground clearance, which is the one kind of odd design decision. So I did already make a whole video about the Corsair, and my thoughts in that video were it's a very solid ship for its role. If you want a big slow ship with a lot of forward facing firepower, it makes sense, and the layout works really well. One thing I did see a comment about that I didn't get a chance to check out is that supposedly there's floodlights on the back here. That is a nice feature, and something that's overlooked on a lot of other ships. If you've ever landed on a moon when it's dark, you know the experience where the ship's built-in lights are usually not enough to be able to see what you're doing, but if this thing really does have floodlights on the back, that's something super useful, and it'll help you be able to line up your landing so that you get the ramp down perfectly for loading up vehicles or whatever you need to be doing. So yeah, actually you can see those lights right here, and those would be perfect for lighting up the area where the ramp is meeting the ground so that either as you're landing or as you're loading a vehicle you can see what you're doing. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, either you can rent one here and check it out yourself, or you can check out my video, but I think overall this ship just has a lot of features like that make sense and show that it's one of the more polished ships in the game at the moment. Although if you do end up renting one of these, be careful when you're pulling it out of the hangar, because it gets pretty windy here on Microtech, and as I mentioned in my review, the lateral thrust is not the strong point of the Corsair, so it tends to drift around a lot. Alright, so walking past Drake's largest offering currently, the Caterpillar, which is a mostly cargo-focused ship, although it's supposedly going to have some modularity at some point where you'll be able to swap out some of these cargo bays for other modules. Alright, let's head off to the left here and quickly take a look at this room full of Cutlasses before we get to the exciting new cutter. And here we have all of the Cutlass variants. I'll quickly go through these. This is the Cutlass Blue. It's kind of the police variant. It's got those typical emergency services lights that you can turn on, a better field of view for the pilot, it's not a quantum interdiction device, but it stops people from quantum traveling away from you, which is an interesting mechanic. And in the back you've got stuff that you would use as someone either in law enforcement or a bounty hunter, in the form of these bounty pods, and hopefully that's something that we can actually use soon, because they are working on bounty missions where you're not just supposed to blow up the target of the mission. Alright, so over here we have a ship that was not very well received by the community, and I think for good reason. It's the Cutlass Steel, but people were spelling it with an A, and at the ship's out-of-game price point, it really does not make sense for basically being a Cutlass Black with some extra drop seats and a few extra guns. So yeah, it does have more firepower than a regular Cutlass, but I don't think that makes it worth more than double the price. And you do have all these drop seats, but in my opinion, with the shielding and hull integrity of a Cutlass, I think you're just making yourself a big target if you fill this up with however many people this fits. It looks to be 18 drop seats in here, so plus the pilots and whatnot. That's a lot of people to be putting in a ship with medium-sized shields, in my opinion. It is kind of cool though to have all of these weapons on this, and I think it'll be a fun ship to fly around, and it'll make a lot more sense to purchase in-game. But there was quite a bit of, I think, justified backlash for the way that they handled the release of this ship. Alright, and then in the middle here, we have the Cutlass Red. This is the ambulance-like variant of the Cutlass. It's meant for search and rescue, so you can see it has a scanning array up there that hopefully will be functional at some point. It's got airlocks for transferring patients from the main medical area in the ship to possibly a larger hospital ship at some point. And then you've got your 2 medical beds here. These are the lowest tier of medical bed, and I think the way their tier system is, these are tier 3, where tier 1 is the highest. So you can't use these to respawn anymore, but they can heal some injuries. And this ship will continue to be more and more useful as the medical gameplay gets more and more refined, so that you hopefully don't die from tripping on the stairs and instead end up with a broken leg or something like that. And then you could actually use this to heal yourself, or have someone come heal you. And then here we have a ship that is a fan favorite, the Cutlass Black. It's a pretty good value. It's a great size for either a solo pilot, but you can also add a second crewmate, and it gives you access to a ton of the gameplay loops. It's got a decent amount of cargo space that could also be used for carrying vehicles. It can do well in combat, and it's just generally fun to fly around. Alright, now moving on to the other side hall over here, we have some of Drake's newer offerings, and some of these are pretty exciting. Let's start off with the ships that are already in the game though. The Buccaneer is Drake's fighter. I believe it's technically a light fighter, and it's not the most maneuverable, but it's very fast in a straight line. Again, with those typical massive main thrusters that you see on Drake ships. And like other Drake ships, it has a lot of weapon hardpoints for its size. It's not always going to be something that's in the meta for like PvP, but definitely for PvE missions, it's a whole lot of fun. And with all those weapon hardpoints, you can deal with a wide range of ship sizes and still be able to cut through even pretty large shields. And then here's the Herald. Unfortunately, there's still not much gameplay for this ship, but whenever hacking and data running gameplay comes in, this will be a great intro into that category. And it does currently have the use of being the fastest ship in a straight line with a main thruster that's about the size of the whole rest of the ship. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what hacking gameplay brings, and it's got these cool features of these drop pods for you to drop data pods. So you could potentially be doing like dead drops of data just floating somewhere in space for someone to pick up later. I think that could be a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to seeing that whenever that starts getting worked on. Alright, so in the middle here we have Drake's newest ship, the Cutter. And this is kind of going to be Drake's Aurora and Mustang competitor. It doesn't have a ton of features, and it's pretty small, but it's got a good balance of things to give you a start into the verse, and it's got a pretty interesting design language. So since you can rent these, I'm actually going to pull one out in a bit to get a more detailed view of it, but the main features are it has 4 SCU of cargo space right here. It has twin size 2 weapons, so nothing too crazy, but it has a decent accommodation for the single crew member, which continues this odd trend of Drake ships having nice accommodations, which we just saw in the Corsair. But again, just like I talked about with the Corsair, it's nice to have options from every manufacturer in each size category, so having a general purpose starter ship from Drake I think is a great thing, especially since so many people like Drake, and before this really your only option was to jump all the way up to a Cutlass. So this is a great way for Drake fans to get started into the game with a smaller purchase if they want to. Alright, and then over here we have a ship that I'm very excited for, because this ship will be bringing a whole new gameplay loop into the game when it comes along, hopefully in 3.18. This is an entry-level salvage ship, and it should be coming with those hull scraping mechanics that they've been showing off, and this is the first time we're seeing it in game actually. So yeah, hopefully I'll be able to test it out in a couple of weeks or so once 3.18 gets released. But just seeing it now, it's already got some pretty cool features, like this exterior ladder, which looks to be one way to access the cockpit. And this is kind of reminiscent of something like large construction vehicles, those like large dump trucks that have external access where you have to climb up to the driver's seat in those vehicles. So yeah, unfortunately you can't rent this yet, and I think they've locked it down pretty well. Although someone will probably figure out how to steal it and manage to fly it off the Expo floor here. But for now we can just take a look at the interior. And actually looking at these living amenities, they're pretty similar to what we just saw in the cutter, which is kind of interesting. I guess this might be the standard for Drake ships moving forwards, which I want to hear you guys' thoughts on, because a lot of Drake fans seem to be fans of the fact that the ships were relatively sparse on the interior and were very utilitarian, and sometimes didn't even have stuff like a toilet, which I guess Drake considers not completely necessary. But then you've got ships like these, which are pretty fully featured. So that's the living area, and then on the lower floor here you've got area for cargo and what looks like some sort of salvage processing equipment here. So yeah, it looks like possibly the salvage will be processed through here and then dispensed into the cargo area automatically with whatever this machinery is, but we'll hopefully be seeing that fully functional in just a few weeks. Alright, downstairs at the ground vehicle display we have Drake's Dragonfly. I think if you have the space to carry one of these over something like an Ox, it is the better space bike, at least from my experience flying it. It just seems to be more stable, and when you land it, it doesn't fall over, so that's definitely a plus. They're not super useful at the moment, but for some of the bunker missions and stuff like that, it's kind of useful to have something where you can land outside of the range of turrets and then just fly it along, and they are kind of fun to fly around. And then here we have the Mule, another utility vehicle, which Drake really seems to be expanding their lineup of recently. This is just a simple ground vehicle with space for a few cargo containers. There's not a whole lot to say about it, but it's relatively compact and effective for what it does. Alright, and then the holoviewer model for today is the Drake Kraken. This is Drake's capital ship. It's a carrier, and it's got the interesting feature of having an open sort of flight deck where you land ships on top of it instead of having an internal hangar. And there's also the privateer variant, which is set up for being sort of a mobile shopping mall, and that'll work well with the external landing bay because you can kind of set this thing up like a small space station and sell whatever you're selling. So unfortunately this thing is still a long ways off, it seems like, but when it does finally get put into the game, it's going to be exciting, and it'll be very cool to see these flying around. Alright, so moving on, let's take a closer look at the cutter. So like I said, the cutter is a ship that's going to compete with the Mustang and the Aurora, so it's in that same price category too. And for that price, I think you're getting a whole lot of ship. At least to me, it seems like it's the best value out of those. So just to quickly compare the specs a little bit, the Aurora and the Mustang I believe both have double the weapons hardpoints, so if you're specifically looking at doing only combat with your starter ship, then the Mustang is still probably going to be the better choice, and the Aurora might be a little bit better of a balance, but this ship definitely has the best living accommodations out of them, with the Mustang having none and the Aurora having a tiny bed at the back. But if you really want your ship to feel like a place you could live out of, this is a great value for that starter ship tier. So I think it's kind of exciting that this is an option now, and it's surprising to see that the starter with the best living accommodations is coming from Drake. So yeah, you'll have to let me know how you guys feel about that if you're recommending ships for people to start out with, they're going to be pointed at Drake as the one with the best living quarters. It's even better than something like the Titan, I think. So yeah, let's get started with that tour. I'll go into a little bit more depth here. So this cargo bay is a little bit large considering the amount of cargo that you can fit in, but that's unfortunately a bit necessary because otherwise there'd be no access to the cockpit since the ramp is the only way on and off of the ship. I kind of wish they had made it somewhat like the Titan where you could enter from the front somehow, but the way that the canopy of the ship is set up, there's no way for that really to work. But yeah, you can see here I've got 2 SU of cargo loaded into this cargo bay. It fits 4, so just the other slot here would normally be filled if it were fully loaded up. And there's a bit of dead space, but this gives you good access to walk through the interior of the ship and also gives you access to all these components that are on the wall here. And this is where the majority of your components are going to be. So whenever we do get the gameplay where you need to service your components or swap them out manually, you will have easy access to them here. And this is unique for this size class, as most ships of this size, especially a lot of the fighters, only have external access to the components. And we'll see that on the Scorpius that I'll take a look at in a minute. But on this ship, you have convenient access to everything from the interior. And one nice little thing is off to either side of the ramp, you have these little windows, and these likely aren't going to be super useful, but they do give you some visibility. And I guess if someone were waiting outside of your ramp for you to open it up and maybe shoot at you or something, they could give you the chance to spot them beforehand. One thing I will say that's a little bit odd about this ship is that the door panel controls are different than the ones that are present on the Corsair. Most other manufacturers seem to have those be consistent across their ships, and I think that makes sense. That's something that you'd see in real world cars where a lot of buttons and general purpose panels are reused across the different models. But these are completely different to the ones on the Corsair, and I personally find these a bit of a pain to use. The actual buttons that you're supposed to be pressing are the little square buttons, those 3 that are stacked in a column on the left hand side, and it's kind of a pain to hit the correct one, but we've seen those get updated on other ships, so there's still a chance that those might get changed out for the asset from the Corsair, but even if they don't, it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so moving past the cargo bay, this next area is the main living accommodations for this ship, and like I mentioned, it's very nice for a ship of this class, and it kind of does take up a lot of space for a ship of this size. I almost would have liked to see the typical Drake approach of having the bare minimum for living accommodations, just so you could maybe fit more cargo, but then again, the difference between having 4 SCU and 6 SCU is not really going to be all that substantial. It's going to be hard for you to make a profit hauling basically anything in that low of a quantity, so who knows if the trade-off is worth it. But in this area we have a bathroom and shower combo. It's relatively spacious, although once you deploy the toilet there's not a ton of space in here, at least for the player model. And then your bed is here on the right side of the ship. And moving forwards towards the access to the cockpit, you have this storage cabinet which gives you access to the inventory of the ship. And then finally moving forwards into the flight deck or cockpit area, there's not a whole lot going on in here. You have access on the left side to what looks like the server blades. Again, not functional yet, but maybe at some point this will be where you swap those out. And it looks like there's empty housing for components here, so I'm not quite sure what that's going to be, or if that's just empty space. And then over to the right side behind the pilot seat, you actually have a functional weapons rack, which is a nice inclusion, and it feels right at home in a Drake ship to have those weapons right next to you as the pilot. That's definitely something that you'd be wanting to have. And then getting into the pilot seat, I'd say that the cockpit view is above average for a Drake ship, so no real complaints here. Alright, getting into the flight performance a bit, this thing is shaped like a big box, and it flies about like that. You can see me flying around in space here though. I would say that the handling in 0G and no atmosphere is better than you'd expect it to be, just given the shape of this ship. It's still no light fighter, but it's not overly sluggish. But in atmosphere is where it really is going to struggle. So this is me flying on Microtech, which has a relatively thick atmosphere, and you can see that I'm barely getting above 100 meters per second with cruise enabled and my limiter way up. So it stays true to its brick shape with brick-like flying. And also, like many of the other Drake ships, it does have a VTOL mode, and this VTOL mode flips the main thrusters vertical. This does greatly improve the up and down strafing abilities of the ship, but I didn't find it to be super useful, especially since you seem to trade off a lot of side-to-side performance when going into VTOL, which is a little bit odd because you would think the relative positioning of those horizontal thrusters wouldn't change, but at least when I was flying it, it seemed like moving side to side while in VTOL was a bit of a pain. This doesn't really hurt anything though, because you can just leave VTOL disabled if you don't want to deal with it, but it's nice to have the option, I guess. And then I'm not really going to spend any time on the combat performance of this ship. It has dual size 2 mounts, and by default it has dual size 1 weapons on those mounts, so you're not really going to be doing much combat with this ship, especially since it's relatively large for the shielding that it has, but having 2 weapons is better than having no weapons, I guess. Now, one thing I did want to try with this is fitting a hover bike in the back, and unfortunately all I had access to is the Dragonfly, which is from Drake, so you'd think there might be a chance of it fitting, but I did try my best to wedge it in here, and it almost fits, but unfortunately as soon as you try to close that rear ramp, it seems to be rejected by the ship. So unfortunately I didn't have easy access to the Apoa Nox, which is the much shorter grav bike, for testing when I was recording this. But if any of you guys want to try it out and let me know in the comments, I'd be very interested in hearing if you could fit one of those in here. I think you could, considering the Dragonfly, at least from what I recall, is a lot longer than that. So if you can do that, I think you'd be able to fit that along with cargo in here, and that would make this a very versatile ship to be able to fit cargo and still fit a grav bike, all in a very basic starter ship. So yeah, just to wrap up my initial impressions on this ship, I think it's a great addition to the verse. It seems like a great value. It's a much nicer interior than the other starter ships, and even nicer interior than some ships that are even higher priced than it, like something like a Titan. It does have those trade-offs of relatively poor flight performance compared to even an Aurora, and worse combat performance due to the lack of weapons hardpoints. But if you're not interested in doing combat with your starter ship, then I think this is a great option, and I'm glad we finally have a starter ship option from Drake. Okay, now moving on, I just want to briefly take a look at the Scorpius. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's really about what you'd expect. It's basically RSI's version of the Hurricane, and at least from my experience with it, there's not a whole lot more to say about it. Just doing a brief walk around of the ship, you can see, much like many of the other modern fighters, it's got external access to pretty much all of the components through these hatches that open up and drop the components out. So in the future, this should allow you to swap those out and do some repairs to the ship in that way. It's also got external access to the ship's storage, so that's nice. Even though it's a fighter, you're still able to bring a few things along with you, which could be useful if you find yourself at an outpost and there's some rare armor there that you'd like to take with you. I think the weapons rack implementation on this ship is a little bit odd. If you look up in the ship to where it's housed, it takes up a whole lot of space just for a weapons rack. Like, you could almost fit a whole nother person in there if you're to do something like the prisoner pod that's attached to the Hawk. So yeah, I think it's a little bit odd to see how much space a weapons rack takes up in a ship that's supposed to be compact, where you can see in stuff like the Gladius, a much smaller internal area that's used up by those weapons. But it's still nice to have this feature, because eventually I think they're going to make it so that, especially in things like fighters, you're not going to be able to have weapons equipped, because it doesn't really make sense for you to have space for a rifle with you in the cockpit of a fighter. But this will allow you to still have access to those weapons once you reach your destination. And so for a brief overview of the flight and combat performance, as a refresher, this ship has 4 size 3 mounts available to the pilot, and then a turret with 4 size 3 mounts on it as well. So I think if you look at raw DPS numbers, that's slightly more than the Hurricane, because the Hurricane has the same setup for the turret, but I believe only dual size 4 hardpoints for the pilot. And another good reference, I think, is this is basically like having the firepower of 2 sabers, but on one ship. But then the trade-off in this instance is it seems to be pretty sluggish. The Hurricane is relatively fast and can almost keep up with medium fighters, I would say, even though it does have about double the armament of a medium fighter. But especially in atmosphere, the Scorpius really seems to struggle. I don't think it should be a super fast ship, but I think in its current state, it is a little bit slow. And one of the benefits of the Hurricane is that it's a small target and relatively fast, so it doesn't get picked apart too much by larger ships. But I feel with the large cross section of this thing, especially with those wings sticking out and that slower speed and that lower maneuverability, it's going to be a bit difficult to use this thing. For PvE missions, this isn't really an issue because you can pretty much always avoid enemy fire, but I recall there was a time where the Hurricane was actually a very solid ship for PvP, and I'm not sure that you'd see the same performance with the Scorpius here. The flight performance is a little bit better when you're not in atmosphere, but it's still not great. And yeah, like I said, I think overall it needs a slight improvement, but they make adjustments to flight performance all the time. So who knows what it'll be like in even a few months from now. So while I do like how the ship looks, I think it's one of the best looking ships in the game, to be honest, and definitely the coolest ship from RSI so far. The best uses for this ship aren't really in the game yet, at least in my opinion. I think this ship will be best suited for times when it's a lot easier to bring additional crew members versus bringing additional ships. That'll be when you're looking at remote areas where you have limited hangar space, because a small ship like this would need to be carried over long distances. So for something like a Polaris, where you're only going to have space for one ship realistically in that hangar, a ship like this would be great because it effectively doubles your firepower versus having another medium fighter. But at the moment, it's very easy to get anywhere in the current playable universe in a fighter, so I think for the most part you're gonna have a better time instead of having a pilot and a gunner in this ship, just having 2 separate fighters. So yeah, I don't think this is necessarily a terrible ship, it's just not super great at the moment, and it's definitely hard to recommend when things like the Hurricane exist, which is definitely comparable, and I think even better in some ways. Those things are a massive pain to hit. But yeah, I want to hear you guys' thoughts on this too. What do you think about the Scorpius, and are you going to be picking one up when RSI is at the Expo? Alright, so that's about it for this video. Thank you all again for watching, and I really appreciate all the nice comments on my previous video welcoming me back. Again, I apologize for the long hiatus, but I want to make sure I'm able to highlight the positive aspects of this game when I'm making videos, and for a while it got a little bit frustrating. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the new cutter, what you think about the Scorpius, and anything related to the Expo. Thank you all for watching.